Okay, good evening, everyone. And my name is Pollerton Little, and you're all very welcome on this wet and windy evening to a lecture I'm especially looking forward to. It's the Historical Society's final lecture of the 21-22 season, and I think it's going to be an excellent lecture. As John said, since we're on Zoom tonight, if everyone could stay mute while the presentation is ongoing. On membership, the Society depends hugely on its members and the work they undertake. And if you're not already a member, you can join the Society for €15 a year. And the details are on our website, carlowhistorical.com, and money and application forms can be posted into PO Box 162, which you'll find the address on the website. Again, just a gentle reminder to our own members, our AGM will be held on the 8th of June in the Seven Oaks Hotel at 8 p.m. The usual format will apply tonight, where we will have our lecture followed by questions and comments. And if anyone wants to put questions in the chat box, feel free to do so. Tonight's speaker is one of our own, Dr. Séamus Ó Murchú. Séamus has worked tirelessly for the Society over a number of years, doing lots of different things. And by profession, he's an archaeologist. I suppose Séamus, being the Pollerton Little being the home place, has an intimate knowledge of the subject of tonight's on what is a nearly forgotten graveyard, which he has a passion about. And he's got us in the Society for once to roll up our sleeves and do a bit of physical work in effectively clearing the site before any recording could take place. So for that reason, I'm looking forward to it. So over to you, Séamus, and we'll take questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks a million for that introduction, Padraig. Can you hear me? Yeah. And thanks to, of course, to everybody who's tuned in here tonight. It was fairly rough and it's starting to clear up a little bit there now, but hopefully you'll enjoy this evening sitting inside the summer's evening. Because I want to take you on a journey tonight through there we go. I want to take you, on a journey tonight across land and time. And to do that, I want to begin with a little story. So tradition holds that there was once a small Franciscan friary in the townland of Oak Park or Painstown, somewhere around where the 9th green of Carlow Golf Club is today. And when a member of the old families in Pollerton Little was about to pass away, a fireball or a ball of light would start to form in the friary, or at least on the friary site. It would go out through the friary gates, up the friary lane to the Palatine Road, and then turn up the hill, turn east, up into the Cruchán. And so in that way, the local community would know that time drew close for one of their members, and someone among them was about to make their own last journey. And this story draws on several themes, including archaeology, history, folklore, and place names. And similarly, I want to present some of those to you here tonight. So the lecture, I'm just going to give you an introduction to the townland of Pollerton Little and its wider environs. Then we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail about the Cruchán, which is the main subject of tonight's talk. And then, having explored this world, I want to finish up with some of the stories and the legends associated with the site and its connections to the other world. So I invite you now, because it's a Zoom lecture, at least you're at home, so I hope you're in your most comfortable chair, and I hope you have a good mug of tea, like my good wife brought into me and delivered before we started. And I hope this is an enjoyable journey through this life and the next. So for those who are watching who are unfamiliar with County Carlow, Pollerton Little is located in the northwestern portion of the county. It's just to the northeast of Carlow Town, as you can see there outlined in red on the image, and with some of the more famous sites like Brownshill Dolmen, Carlow Castle and Oak Park House, just as reference points for anybody who's not familiar with the area. We're very close to the Kildare border, but thankfully and crucially, we're just to the south of it and safely in the confines of Carlow. If there's a Pollerton Little, that means there's a Pollerton Big, and there certainly is. So Pollerton Big is 381 acres, and Pollerton Little is about 299 acres. So that's quite a get to claim the big title. The area is still primarily rural, but urban sprawl is definitely making its presence known, particularly in recent years. So the townland is mixed agricultural use today between livestock and tillage farming. There's lots of one-off or single housing, as well as modern housing developments and industrial developments on both sides of the townland. Now, if you've ever driven in or out of Carlow on the Dublin Road, you're more familiar with this place than you realise, because it's bisected across the middle by the N9 motorway, or sorry, the N9 roadway, the old N9, which was constructed between 1849 and 1850. But in the context of tonight's lecture, the townland's greatest claim to fame is that it's been the home place of two former Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society presidents, my grandfather Séamus Murphy and the late and great Mary Teresa Kelly. So an important element of the natural heritage of the area is the Aska stream, which gives its name to the modern Catholic parish of Aska. So the name Aska comes from the Irish Ishka, which literally means water. So the stream translates, or the name of the stream literally translates as the stream of water. It's got several sources in Pollerton and in the surrounding areas, but the main course of it starts up in Knockaunarelic to the northeast. It comes in and forms the townland boundary between Pollerton Little to the south and Oak Park to the north. And then it turns south and forms the western boundaries of the two Pollertons to the east and Ratnapish to the west. It continues then in towards the town. You'll actually cross it on the N9 roadway as well, just there at Boland's car dealership and the new IDA development that's going on there as well. But it goes in underground then, and it's piped. It goes in under the St. Lawrence O'Toole's running track. That area around there was known as the Yellow Lock. It continues over to where the credit union is now, and that used to be called Aska Bridge. And then it joins the River Burn just around where Woody's is today. Just by way of background and the history of human activity around the Cruchán, we're going to look briefly at the archaeology and history of the townland. Now, this is going to be very brief because it's not the main subject of the talk tonight. In reality, you could nearly do a whole series of lectures just on the archaeology and history of Pollerton Little itself, or the wider Pollerton area. But early evidence for human activity in the area is, I suppose, best exemplified in the Brownsill Dolmen, which is located in the neighbouring townland of Town to the south. We have our own Neolithic remains also in the townland. I found a snapped flint blade myself in 2019, and that's now in the National Museum of Ireland. There was archaeological excavations carried out on the Castle Oaks estate in the eastern, or the western, portion of the townland in 2008. And there they found a whole series of pits containing charcoal, burnt remains, and that also included burnt human bone, which was radiocarbon dated to the Bronze Age. There's also been a lot of archaeological excavations carried out on the Merksharpen Dome development. Well, part of it is in Pollerton Little, but the majority of it is just to the north. And lots of archaeological features have been identified in those excavations, and they include two Neolithic structures, as well as a whole series of Neolithic pits, Neolithic pottery and stone tools, an early Bronze Age structure with associated decorated pottery, a funerary food vessel of the bowl tradition, which is also Bronze Age, a late Bronze Age structure, as well as an Iron Age pit and a ring ditch, which was likely used in ceremonial activities. Evidence for human activity then continues into the early medieval period. There's a large hilltop enclosure in the present Carlow Golf Club, and it's on top of a hill that's known as, or known locally as Camp Hill. And there's two traditions as to how it got its name, but one of them is that it was used as a campsite prior to the Battle of Ballachmoon in AD 908. And that was fought just to the northeast in County Kildare. And the Battle of Ballachmoon was fought between Cormac MacQuillenan, who was the King of Munster, against an alliance led by Flann Sinna, the High King of Ireland, and it ended in a decisive victory for Flann Sinna. But the typical form of settlement in early medieval Ireland was the ring fort, and while we have none recorded in Pollerton Little itself, there's certainly two in the neighbouring and adjoining townlands, one to the east in Pollerton Big, and one to the north in Oak Park or Painstown. And the one in Oak Park or Painstown is on the Mark Sharpen Dome site. A portion of the enclosing ditch around it was excavated, and they found animal bone in the bottom of the ditch, which was radiocarbon dated to between 935 and 1016 AD. Everybody, I suppose, will be familiar with the drought of 2018, which formed a key role in identifying hundreds of previously unrecorded archaeological features all over the country as crop marks, particularly in tillage fields. And Pollerton Little was no different, because the outline of a previously unrecorded circular enclosure became obvious in a tillage field just to the south of the Dublin Road at that time. And the circular nature of it might imply that it's a levelled ring fort itself. Archaeological excavations elsewhere on the Mark Sharpen Dome site as well also uncovered 3 cereal drying kilns and a metalworking site, all of which dated to the early medieval period. And then there was also a trench-like feature uncovered, which contained Irish-made pottery, which was dated to between the 12th and the 14th centuries. Now, as I alluded to at the outset of the lecture, there's a local tradition that there was a small friary in Oak Park Estate around what's the 9th green of Carlow Golf Club today. And the presence of this friary is still preserved in the name of the laneway, or what's now a roadway, the Friary Lane, which links the old Balton Glass Road to the entrance of Carlow Golf Club. And there's also a friary roughly marked on that location, or in this location, on William Aylan's 1824 map of Carlow. And now, whether there's a friary there or not, Pollerton Little, or at least part of it, was associated with the Knights Hospitallers in Killerick. And it formed part of their holdings around the time of the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. And it's possible that the burial ground, which we'll come to now shortly, in the southern part of the townland, was centred around a site that was associated with the Knights Hospitallers. There's a few medieval references to the townland as well. So with the arrival of the Normans, a lot of the land in this area was granted to the Walls family. And by the 1540s, there was 2 Walls, Thomas Wall Fitzjohn and Guido Wall, who were named as living in Pollerton in the Crown Survey of Lands in 1540. As well, there's also a John Barry, who was a juror in the Manor of Carlow, named at that time. In 1604, King James I and VI granted Carlow Castle and the manor to Donatus O'Brien, the Earl of Thomond. And one of the stipulations was that the inhabitants of Dunganstown, Painstown, Johnstown, and Pollerton, with ploughs and carts, were required to plough the domain land for 1 day a year for wheat and oats, and every house with a draft horse had to draw wood and corn to the castle of Carlow for 1 day. So by implication, that would suggest that there was at least some bit of a sizable population in the area. Pollerton's also referenced in the 1641 depositions, which followed the upheavals and the rebellion of that year, when Ruth Crisp gives an account of having to flee with her husband, Henry Crisp, who she describes as being a rector and a minister of God's word. And they had to run into Carlow Castle after their property was attacked by a Catholic neighbour of theirs living in the area as well, and others by the name of William Mackey. After the 1641 rebellion, the Walls, like many Catholic landowners across Ireland, were dispossessed, and by 1670 this area was owned by Samuel Blackwell, who was a Protestant, and he was in possession of the lands. There's a reference as well in 1685 to a Catholic resident of Pollerton by the name of Allen, who intervened in damages that were being caused to the property of the Brown Clayton family, which of course are associated with Browns Hill. Now, after the rule of King James, of course, or King James II, you get the Williamite period and the introduction of the penal laws, and they penalised, of course, the practice of the Roman Catholic religion, and they imposed civil disabilities on Catholics. And the common response for this, or to this, was for religion to be practiced in secret, generally in private houses or in open air sites. And many people will be familiar with the mass rocks all across the country. Now, Pollerton itself doesn't have a mass rock, but it does have a tradition of a penal mass site. And older residents of the area, or older residents of Carlow, will remember the site as Al Kelly's Pump, which is today the car park of the range and Supermax. And the area around Highfield housing estate was known as the Lookout, where supposedly men would keep watch on the higher ground for approaching soldiers from the town. There's also a penal cross known from the town. It's a smaller one in the image there on screen. And that was formerly in the small museum that was in Knockbeg, and I believe it's in the county museum now. But the penal cross in question was owned by Michael Dwyer of Pollerton, and it had been passed down in his family. And he himself died in 1926 before it was donated to Knockbeg. Before we move on to the Cruchán itself, I just want to highlight that it's not the only burial site in the area, because in 1890, the Nationalist and Leinster Times and the Freeman's Journal both gave an account of the discovery of 13 or 14 skeletons during the excavation works in a sandpit on the lands of a Mrs. Kelly. They speculate at the time, or they indicate that there was speculation at the time that they were associated with the 1798 rebellion, but that's probably unlikely. And the remains were reinterred elsewhere in the field. But one of they described the location of it as being 300 to 400 yards on the town side of the entrance to Pollerton House on the Old Balkan Glass Road, or the Palatine Road. So if we look at the 1890s 25-inch edition Ordnance survey map, at this time we can see that there's two sand pits or gravel pits on the town side of the entrance to the Pollerton House. And one of them is only 95 yards distant, but more importantly and significantly, another one is 340 yards different distance, which would fit the description. And if we overlay the modern maps onto this, we can see that it was somewhere roughly around where the Kingswood or possibly the back of Beechwood housing estate is today. So just to move on, sorry, to the subject of the talk tonight, or the main subject. I hope that sets some of the scene and the historic land use background for the site in question. It's a burial ground. It's included on the record of monuments places by the National Monument Service. It's located just in the southern part of the townland, just to the south as well of the old Palatine, or sorry, the Palatine Road, or the old Balkan Glass Road. It's situated on a small hill or a local prominence, which is called Knockaunarelic, which has been anglicised as Knockaunarelic. And that's it translates as the small hill of the burial ground, and it's kind of known locally for short as the Cruchán, or the whole hill is kind of known as the Cruchán as well. And just to clarify as well that it's, despite it being sited on the Palatine Road, and just so nobody's confused, this burial ground has no relationship to the modern housing development or recent development that has reappropriated the name on Cruchán, which is in the townland of Pollerton Big. So the burial ground is depicted on the first edition Ordnance Survey 6-inch map of 1839, and it's shown at that time as a small little enclosure. Now, the Ordnance Survey letters that document some of the kind of local place names and history and monuments as the Ordnance surveyors were traveling around the country, they describe this site as having 2 headstones of modern date standing within it, and that there's no appearance of a church ever being in the place. So it's a fairly concise description. The headstones they're most likely referring to are the O'Neill headstone and the Rhine headstone, which are located in the western portion of the burial ground. And the most recent transcriptions around 1839 that are on them are 1833 and 1834. But the oldest headstone in the burial ground is a Kelly headstone, which is dated to either 1772 or 1779. It's kind of hard to read the final number on the headstone. By the time of the 25-inch edition Ordnance survey map, we can see that the present boundaries of the burial ground had formed at that time. It was situated in the middle, or kind of within a larger field enclosure, and it was accessed by a laneway, which was known as Lover's Lane. Now, the late 19th century saw the enclosure of many of these rural burial grounds, just like this one, under a series of acts of parliament, and Cruchán was no different. And the tradition here, though, is that the burial ground, or what they enclosed, was only what they could afford at the time, which is about a 45 by 28 metre area. And it also has this kind of unusual bend on the northwest corner. And that's also supported in the historical, and the fact that they only enclosed what they could afford is supported in the historical and archaeological records. Now, the decision to enclose the Cruchán was made by the Board of Guardians in early 1867, and they advertised it in the local newspapers such as the Carlow Morning Post over the following months. And this would prove to be what seemed to be, anyway, reading the records, a very long and drawn out process, because in January 1877, a letter was read to the meeting of the Board of Guardians from the then tenant of the land in which the burial ground was situated, a Mr. William Haid. And by that time, the marking out of the enclosing wall had begun, almost a full decade after it had been advertised in the first place. And Haid stated that he wouldn't consent to any more of the burial of the site being enclosed than that had been exempted by the poor law evaluators. And the clerk noted that only 26 statute perches were being enclosed, and as he understood it, that there were several burials still outside the boundary. So they decided then that no further work should take place until a report had been received on the matter from an inspector of the local government board. And that report subsequently identified that the area being argued over in particular, or that there was at least some contention over anyway, was 5 perches of land. So the project to construct the wall then was obviously agreed, and it was put out to tender in March 1877. There was only one tender received, so they re-advertised it. And on this occasion, William Haid himself submitted a quote, which the Board of Guardians refused. The wall was subsequently constructed, from what I can see, based on the quote of a Patrick Nolan of Rutland, and he proposed to build a wall for 11 shillings per cubic perch and £3 for a gate. And you can see there, that's the gate, that's the original gate on the burial ground. It was an iron gate. But the newly enclosed space then from the 1870s continued in use as a burial ground throughout the late 19th century and well into the 20th century. Carlow's burial grounds then were surveyed in 1938 by the Carlow Board of Health and Public Assistance. Many rural burial grounds were starting to be recommended at this time for closure under changes in the sanitation laws. And in that 1938 report, the Cruchán is described at that time as being enclosed by a very good stone wall in the middle of a meadow field, with the gated entrance accessed at the top of a short lane. It was noted that the recent burials which had taken place were all levelled flat, which they said was an unusual practice. And they also noted that the burial ground appeared to be of ancient use and likely of greater extent than is now enclosed by the walls. And they also say that the burial ground, so nothing has really changed since, was in bad need of attention, but it was evident that families were caring for their own individual graves. There was a follow-up report then done in June 1946, and they said at that time that the burial ground was overcrowded with mounds of graves, and the site was recommended for closure, for a formal closure. Now, despite that was in 1946, it remained in use, from what I can see, into the 50s at least anyway, for the burial of infants, which was a common practice in Ireland at the time, when unbaptized babies were generally not permitted to be buried in consecrated ground. So after the closure of the burial ground, there was a whole series of houses constructed in the immediate surrounding area. And in the course of the excavation works and sometimes gardening works, or early gardening works associated with those houses, human bones and skeletons were uncovered on several occasions, in some cases up to almost 100 meters away from the formerly enclosed space, which supports the historic records that burials were located outside the newly enclosed space, and that also suggests that it has much earlier origins. The interior of the burial ground also became overgrown throughout the late 20th century, to the point that in 1990, a cleanup of the burial ground, and this was the first of them, from what I can see. A cleanup of the burial ground was organised by the Carlow Heritage Society, and they removed a lot of the vegetation in the site and cleaned it up before they moved on to the old graves down by the Barrow Track. But little else happened to the site then after that for the next 2 decades. When in 2010, 3 of the neighbours around the site, Joe Callan, the landowner through his lands that you access it, Frank Menton, and my grandfather, Séamus Murphy, organised for a cutback of the vegetation in the site to make it some way accessible again, because of course at that time it was completely overgrown. Now, despite these 2 phases of work, again, the vegetation just took over completely again, and most importantly, we still had no record of who was interred in the burial ground. So for that reason, in 2018, I contacted John Tierney of Archeology and Historic Graves of Ireland to organise a survey of the headstones in the burial ground. So we met on site in April 2018 with Joe Callan, the landowner, and we put a plan in place together to get this these headstones recorded. We applied for funding from the local authority, Carlow County Council, through the Creative Ireland programme, and Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society also put funding towards the project. And that funding covered the hire of equipment, it covered the training of the volunteers in headstone recording and survey, and it also hosts the survey results on the Historic Grave website. Now, because the site is a recorded monument, we also applied for permission from the National Monument Service, and we were granted that permission. And everything was put in place to be done on the 21st and the 22nd of June. So the plan was for 1 day to get the vegetation under control, and then 1 day to do the recording. And as you can see in the images, at that time in April, the site was partly overgrown. It was more or less accessible, but the briars were causing a bit of a problem. So the whole thing seemed very achievable, and like it wasn't going to take too much to get it under control and to be able to get in and out kind of safely. But by the June bank holiday weekend, this is what we were presented with. The whole place was completely overgrown in willow herb and briars that were in some places taller than we were. The gate, it was so bad, the gate couldn't even be opened properly, and even the largest headstones that you could see closer to the entranceway were completely overgrown, which didn't bode well for some of the low-lying ones. So Padraig Dooley and John Kelly and myself, on the start of June, we went in and we cut kind of pathways through the site. So this was the first day that Padraig was talking about there at the start, and we cut kind of pathways through it and kind of opened up kind of or marked off areas for the larger group of volunteers to be able to get in and work at later in the month. And by the end of that day, at least, you could get in through the gate. So the main works then obviously started on the 21st of June, 2018. It turned out to be one of the hottest days of that year, and that was of course 2018, which I don't think anybody needs any reminder of what the weather was like at that stage. And this site in particular is south facing, and it has a whole series of trees around it. So we had absolutely no wind in it and just the sun beating down on us all day. But the long undergrowth and vegetation was all trimmed down. There was no trees or shrubs or anything like that cut. The only targets were the willow herb and the briars, which were dominating the site. Now, one of the issues, of course, was that there would be low-lying stones throughout the burial ground like this, and we didn't want the strimmer wire to damage those. So we probed around a little bit before you strim the place to try and identify the stones, and then you could mark them off with kind of corryboard sheets, like election posters, basically, or old election posters to protect the stones. And by the end of the day, the place was finally starting to look like a cemetery again. We had the largest group of volunteers then on the second day who spent the morning cutting and raking the vegetation away. We didn't remove anything from the site. Everything was piled up mainly in 2 heaps to allow it to break down and be a bit of a habitat for insects. We didn't use any chemicals on the site, and the whole process was just cut and rake and then carry the stuff away to the piles. And the reward for our labours was finally being able to see the headstones within the site and get a proper appreciation of their details. So as you can see there in the images, there's a few different styles of headstone and iron crosses. All of the memorials in the Cruchán represent upright headstones. The two lying flat that you can see there in the image have fallen over, one of them, the Rhine headstone, having broken in the process. There's no recumbent slabs, there's no table tombs, there's no chest tombs, there's no crypts or anything like that. But what's also interesting about the headstones in particular is that no two headstones are the same, no two iron crosses are the same. Each one has its own unique style or dressing or form or size, which surely would have been identifiable to their family members upon entering the site. As well as the sculpted headstones, there's an even greater number of low stone markers that have no inscriptions on them, and they probably mark the sites of some of the more poorer members of society or in the area. But even here, people manage to find ways to mark their graves. So they used unusual shaped stones or different color stones, or maybe a split stone to make their family grave or plot identifiable. So for example, there in the top image, you can see a row of 3 stones. One is an upright slate, one is a kind of a pointed stone, and one has a more sloped edge on it. On the bottom there, you can see a kind of a white stone that's been split. And then beside it, there's 2 little stones that have been turned kind of to slightly face one another. And there's even one case where there on the bottom left, where there appears to be a whole family plot marked off with a whole line of headstones, each one slightly different. There's a triangular one, a more rectangular one, a square one, a rounded one, and that probably represents either individuals within the plot or maybe a wider family group, such as, you know, as in one cousin had the triangular stone, one set of cousins had the square stone, etc. At one time, probably very identifiable to somebody, but probably now lost to time. One of the more interesting things as well that we identified was the possible footings of a small structure, and the volunteers there are marking out its edges at 6 corners. Now, the shape of the structure resembles the chancel and the nave of a early medieval church. And what's notable about it as well is it's on the highest point in the burial ground, and for that matter, the highest point in the kind of immediate surrounding area anyway. Now, if it is a church, it's very small, but possibly an oratory. But as we've seen, as I said, there's no tradition of a church ever being located in the area. So once we'd identified all the stones, the process of recording began, and everybody was briefed, as you can see there in the top right, by John Tierney. There was on what they were going to do, and everybody was assigned a task. There was a sketch plan made of the whole burial ground, and then each headstone was numbered, both on site and on the sketch plan for the survey records. We then went around and each one was photographed and the inscription was transcribed, and even other details or unusual details such as Latin inscriptions or a small prayer or the sculptor's name were also recorded. Now, because of the age of this burial ground, a lot of the stones and headstones in particular were kind of faded and very difficult to read. So in those cases, John Tierney showed us a technique to record difficult to read headstones. And if you take nothing else away from tonight's lecture, let it be this. So what you do is you wait for the sun to go, and you need it to be a sunny day, you wait for the sun to go behind the headstone, which conveniently in an old Catholic burial ground is generally, which are generally laid east-west, is in the afternoon. And you get a mirror, as John is demonstrating there on the top left, and you stand to the side of the stone and you bounce light off the mirror, the sunlight off the mirror across the face of the stone at an angle. Now you might have to move it around to get a look at it. And then you're able to read what's on the stone, and you can see Padraig there taking a photograph of what is visible. And to demonstrate the, I suppose, the magic basically that you get with this, this is the Lacey headstone, where you can hopefully clearly read the inscription that's within the sunlight, but there is an inscription just there underneath the sunlight, which you can't read. And the most exciting example of this technique was this little granite slab, which is just inside the entrance. Because of its location, it was one of the obvious headstones that we were kind of always aware of, but it seemed to be completely plain, undecorated, uninscribed, like many of the small headstones and stones lying around the burial ground. But when you bounce light across it, these initials BM and two little punctuation marks came to light. So that was just hiding in plain sight for all those years. So as I say, I hope it reflects the value in that technique. And another way you can do it on a dull day is if you have a very strong torch with a good beam on it, you can hold it around the letter inscription, and kind of you might have to move it around a little bit, but again, the shadow of the indent of the grave lettering should pop in the torch beam. So all of the transcriptions and the photographs, as well as the sketch plan of the site, have been uploaded to the Historic Graves website. So all you need to do is just Google Knockaunarelic and Historic Graves, or else www.historicgraves.com will bring you to the main website, and then you use the Explore tab, which I hope you can see my mouse, which is here. And you can then search for this burial ground, as well as other burial grounds elsewhere in Carlow that have been recorded and uploaded to the site, and any other across the country. So looking at our survey results, so what can we say about the burial ground itself? So the burials are all orientated east-west, and are organized roughly into 10 identifiable rows. There's about 26 headstones of various forms, which are very clearly identifiable as burial markers. But in addition to that, there's a whole clatter of earth isolated or what seemingly isolated, or stones that are slightly out of step with the main alignments, but are earth vast throughout the burial ground, which likely also represent grave markers. I hope you can see my mouse, but the possible church or oratory was located in this part, in the northeastern side of the burial ground. And another nice feature about it is that there's 4 trees marking the 4 corners of the Keegan burial place. One of the interesting things about the layout of the burial ground as well, that John Tierney was pointing out, is that most burial grounds have a clear focus of the burial activity on the southern side of the burial ground, or of the church if there is one. But this one has more of a focus on the northern side, and we have this huge empty area, or what seems to be an empty area, on the southern side. Now, there could also possibly be small stones that have been either moved or lie buried, or even recumbent slabs or fallen headstones in that area, because we didn't do any probing or poking or excavation or any digging of any kind during the works. It was only what was on the surface. So there's a total of 39 individuals recorded in stone within the bounds of the burial ground on 11 stones, and they belong to 13 different families. The earliest one, like I said earlier, is a Margaret Kelly, and what looks like N-O-L-D. It's kind of hard to read that inscription. They're Kelly, and they died in either 1772 or 1779. And they go up to the last inscription, which is Ellen Keegan, who died in 1911. And it was Ellen Keegan herself who erected the stone in the first place to commemorate her previously deceased relatives. The other family names recorded are Rhines and O'Neills, Lawlers and Lawlesses, Walls and Dobbinses, Rices, Shaws, Whelans, Hickeys, Lacey's, and that unknown set of initials. The only addresses that are recorded are Walls of Pollerton, who incidentally lived in the field on the opposite side of the road to the burial ground, Rices of Pollerton Little, Keegans of Pollerton Little, Lawlers of the Pollerton Road, and Shaws of Knocknagees. So all of the addresses that are given are individuals either living in Pollerton Little or in the immediately neighbouring townlands. One of the interesting inscriptions in particular as well was John Ryan, or the Ryan headstone, which was erected by John Ryan, who was a sergeant in the Carlow militia. And his wife, one of the 2 individuals who's commemorated on the stone, passed away in 1834, aged 64 years. So it's possible that John Ryan himself was a member of the Carlow militia in 1798, when they were at that time based in Navan, or around Navan in County Meath. There's only one headstone as well that has the name of the sculptor or the stone cutter on it, which is the Whelan and Hickey headstone, which is inscribed with Kavanagh's of Carlow. So as we've seen already, as well as those inscribed stones, the greatest number of burial markers are these uninscribed grave markers. And there's at least 15 identifiable ones which sit nicely in the rows. and there's at least 7 of those are uninscribed iron crosses in various states of preservation. But as I said, there's a huge number of randomly placed but earth-fast stones which don't fit into those neat rows, and they also likely represent burial markers. And as we've seen, there's also burial activity outside the walls of the burial ground. But as well as those people that are commemorated in it, there's people that we're certain are buried in it, but aren't commemorated. So my own great-great-grandfather, George Rice, is buried here, as well as his second wife, Margaret Rice, and their child, Willie Rice. I was informed by John Deacon of Palatine that his baby sister, Anne, was buried here in the late 50s in what would have been her grandparents' grave. The location in the burial ground is a bit uncertain, and there's no Deacon headstone, as we've seen. And that also indicates that burial activity was certainly taking place after the formal enclosure of the burial ground. There was a post put about the work that we carried out in 2018 on the Society's Facebook page, and Bernie Dooley provided information that her grandmother, Sarah Buckley, is buried here, and she had married Michael Murphy. And just that Buckley Murphy headstone, I'm not sure if that's the BM initials that we saw there a short while ago. That's possible. My uncle Liam, when he visited the burial ground after we cleared it in 2018, he spent time looking for the headstone of the Doyles of the Hill. And there's no visible Doyle headstone, but he insisted that there definitely was one there, and that it was located in the southwestern portion of the burial ground, which suggests that it's either fallen over and it's become buried, or it was possibly removed and possibly re-erected in another burial ground elsewhere. But one of the most interesting group of people to be buried here that aren't commemorated in stone, but I believe there was for a period a wooden cross marking the grave, is the Snoddy family. And I'm grateful to the local historian Michael Purcell for providing this information, because Michael's great-grandfather was Sam Snoddy, and he was a Presbyterian Ulsterman from Ballymena in County Antrim. And he came to Carlow to work on the railway line and settled on the Pollerton Road in 1845. And on the first day of September 1849, he went to work early in the morning, but when he returned that night, his wife Sarah and 2 children, John and Anne, had died, and their remains had been buried in the Cruchán burial ground. But in the last hours before they were buried, or before they died, they were baptized and they were received into the Roman Catholic faith by Reverend Cairns. And Michael says, as how much say they had in their sudden conversion, he can't say, but all he knows is that when Sam went to work that morning, he left behind a wife with 2 children, all of the Presbyterian faith, and when he returned, they were dead and buried and Roman Catholic. But Sam himself later converted to Catholicism. And that was a burial that took place, well, at least in the years of the Great Famine. And during the works, and suggests that the burial ground, was used for burials in that period. And during those works, we identified a large rectangular depression just inside the entrance, which is about 6 meters by 6 meters in size. And we speculated at the time whether it represented the remains of maybe a mass burial pit, possibly associated with the famine. Now, traditionally, I suppose the people of Pollerton were largely unaffected by the famine. And that was because the average size of the farms in this area were around 40 acres and of mixed agriculture, so there was less reliance on the potato crop. That doesn't mean that the townland wasn't or didn't see the impacts of the famine. So one of the responses of the famine that we'll all be familiar with are the public work schemes, such as road building projects and projects on landed estates. And between 1849 and 1850, the present Dublin Road was built through the townland and reorientated the road away from Oak Park, where it used to pass through, and back through Pollerton instead. And by doing this, it allowed Henry Brune of Oak Park to convert a huge part of his holdings into a deer park. And there was a few families evicted off his estate as part of that deer park works. And that deer park largely occupies the site of Carlow Golf Club today. And there was a wall constructed to enclose the deer park, which can still be seen in Carlow Golf Club, on the old road through Oak Park, and on the main Dublin Road today. And that wall was built under a famine relief scheme that was funded by the Board of Works and by the Brunes themselves. Now, the story of Sam Snoddy highlights the importance of folk memory in preserving the names of those interred in the burial ground. And folk memory also preserves the customs and practices around death and burial in the locality as well. And I'm quite lucky to have had grandparents and great uncles and aunts who had a huge interest in history and local traditions to pass on some of this information and their memories of the burial ground's use in its final years. So I just want to finish up the talk tonight with some of those stories and their memories. So, of course, every good Irish funeral is preceded by a good wake, and the dead were generally waked in their own houses rather than the modern practice in funeral homes, and they were usually waked either in their own bed or in a bedroom off the main room of the house. Traditionally, families themselves were much more involved in the funerary process, and the body was often washed and prepared by neighbours and family, and a vigil was maintained around the dead person. Now, while this was all happening, the men of the locality would dig the grave and have it ready before the coffin arrived. And my grandfather used to tell the story of his own grandfather, George Rice's funeral in 1932, when he and his brother Sean were sent across to the grave diggers with bottles of tea and sandwiches. And the men stopped to take a break, and Sean got down into the grave and started to root around. And one of the men said to him, "What's that there beside your head?" And the grandfather said he'd never seen anybody move as fast, either before or since, because 1 second Sean was down below on the bottom of the grave, and the next he was halfway across the cemetery. Because the thing that had spooked him was in the edge of the grave cut, there was a scalp sticking out with the hair still attached. That was, of course, a solemn time, and an early lesson for my grandfather. Was one windy day when he, as a child, was playing with his siblings in the field opposite the Cruchán, and they were turning their coats up against the wind and trying to stay upright against these huge sails against their back. And of course, with that kind of messing around, they were causing a whole load of shouting and roaring. But there was a funeral happened to be coming down the Palatine Road towards the Cruchán, and he says he remembers his father coming over afterwards, crossing the field absolutely furious, demanding to know whether they had any respect for the dead. Once the wake was over, the person would have been loaded into the coffin if they weren't in it already, in preparation for their final journey. And traditionally in this area, the person was brought straight to the burial ground. They didn't go to the church, as is the practice today. There's no tradition of resting stones or coffin resting pillars as you find in many parts of the country. Now, that might be because, at least by the late 20th century, coffins were being brought to the church, as you can see there in the top, or the example in the top right image there, on a horse-drawn funerary coach or carriage. And one of the undertakers that used to draw the carriage were the powers of Pollerton Road. Now, when I say that the funeral went to the house, straight from the house to the grave, it wasn't quite that straightforward, and that's best illustrated in the last journey of my great-great-grandfather, George Rice, in 1932. Because the shortest route for George Rice to have been brought to the burial ground would have been to go away from his house, up the Dublin Road slightly, turn down the Priory Lane, turn up the hill, up the Palatine Road, and into the Cruchán. But poor old George instead was brought straight up the Dublin Road to Ballybargle, turned up Cavanagh's Hill to Ballylennon Cross, and then double backing himself all the way back down to the Palatine Road to the Cruchán. And his wife, Margaret Rice, was also brought on the same journey in 1944. Now, that practice of bringing people the long way around to the burial ground isn't unusual in Ireland, and one of the reasons being a belief that if the soul remained trapped on this earth, at least by bringing it the long way around, you would have confused it, and it would have prevented it returning to the family home place. In a time before good medical prognosis, people looked elsewhere for signs of an approaching death of an individual who was sick, or at least a warning that a sick person was about to pass away. And similarly, death was sometimes often a turbulent time, which could cause upheaval in a family. And this was often reflected in the unusual practices, or what was seen to be unusual practices in nature. So according to the former Society president, Mary Teresa Kelly, bees were used to predict future events, including death and marriage or emigration. Many people, even today, still believe that a robin is a sign that a lost relative is visiting them. But in folklore, robins are also depicted as messengers or warnings of an impending death in a family. And George Rice in 1932, as we've already seen. When he was sick, he was being looked after by different family members, including my great-grandmother. And one day she went up to get fresh sheets from her own house. And before she headed out the door again, a robin began to tap on the window of the house. And at that point, she knew he had passed away, because a similar thing had happened with other members of the Rice family before they died. In 1937, a step-uncle of hers, Patrick Rice, also fell sick with the flu, and the worst was expected at the time. But my great-grandmother was in her home place with her stepmother, Margaret Rice, at the time, when the cock began to crow and flap in the middle of the day, which was an unusual occurrence. And with that, Margaret Rice said that Patrick is dead, and they got the news confirming that within the hour. Of course, the most famous omen of death in Ireland is the Banshee, who needs absolutely no introduction. And depending on the family, or even sometimes the place you are in Ireland, the Banshee is either witnessed, often as a washerwoman or a woman combing her hair, or she's heard crying or keening, or even shrieking or wailing. And we have both traditions in Pollerton. In the first instance, the Banshee would sometimes appear at a certain tree when a member of the Hughes family, who formerly lived in the area, was about to pass away. And that's the only instance I've come across, and happily to be corrected as well, of her appearing in human form, because the more common way that she would have manifested herself was shrieking and wailing. And my grandfather used to tell a story about when he was on leave from the army in Christmas 1942. The Banshee was heard up at the Ballylennon crossroads on the way to Palatine, and the shrieks and wails were heard the whole way down the Palatine Road back in towards Pollerton. And they briefly pausing outside each of the house on the way down. And the last place that she was heard was at the gable end of his house. Now, Nanny Dooley, who was staying in the house at the time and used to give help around the house, she was woken by the sound, as was my great-grandfather. And she was so disrupted by it, she refused to go back to bed after it. And my grandfather said he didn't hear anything himself, but he got all the commotion in the morning. And he was a firm skeptic and didn't have much of a belief in fairies or the supernatural or anything like that. And he maintained himself that it was only cats fighting. But whether it was the Banshee herself, or whether it was cats fighting, or whatever you want to choose to believe, one person in every house between Ballylennon and that house died within the year, including my own great-grandfather, who died suddenly in Christmas 1943. As well as sights and sounds, lights was another way the supernatural could manifest itself in this area. And my granduncle Padraig used to tell a story that he was working in the fields one day with a friend immediately below the Cruchán, when suddenly this huge big shaft of light just erupted from the ground and shot up into the air. And when I asked him to describe it a bit more detail, he said he couldn't, because they didn't stick around. They ran back to the house and wouldn't come out of it for a while. Sorry, but if you've seen Lord of the Rings, I like to think of it as like the scene outside Minas Morgul, when Frodo and Sam and Gollum are just about to head up the stairs into Mordor. The movement of light through the townland, as we've already seen, was a local warning of an impending death in one of the local families, when a ball of light would form on the site of the old friary on the 9th green of Carlow Golf Course. It would travel down the Friary Lane, turn up the Palatine Road and into the Cruchán. My great-grandmother claimed she witnessed it and described it as like sunlight reflecting off a biscuit tin. And my granduncle Sean told me that he himself saw it, and he described it like a torch pulsing, like as if it was somebody was dimming and brightening a torch. And he said he saw it in the 1930s. But this story of a ball of light or lights suddenly shooting up out of the ground isn't unique to Pollerton, and certainly not unique to Carlow, because lights are reported, or strange lights and things like that are reported all over the country. And there's other examples of it all over the northwestern part of County Carlow. So after an article I wrote in Carlow some years ago about the Pollerton ball of light in particular, Laura Gann emailed me to tell me a tradition in her family, who were Flemings, who had formerly lived in the railway cottage in Carlow train station. And her grandfather unfortunately fell ill in 1980, and he was in hospital for a while. And her grandmother said that one day a ball of light came in through the front door. It went around the house and out through the back door, which she took to be a sign that her husband had passed away. And someone in the meantime phoned the hospital, phoned her son, and he called up to the house afterwards to tell her the news, which she already knew. The National Folklore Collection is a fantastic resource for traditions and folk customs, which were gathered from the 1930s onwards. And there's lots of accounts in these of balls of light appearing all over the place. And just a few of these examples include a story by John Morris of Browns Hill in 1938, when he said that every night at about 10 or 11 o'clock, a light goes out of the ring fort in Browns Hill. It goes up to Viewmount and then out to the avenue. And some people say that it's Willie the Wisp. The music is often heard in the fort as well, and it's described as like violins or melodious playing. Also in 1938, John Lennon of Burton Hall recorded that light was often seen in the enclosure on Camp Hill that we've already seen in Carlow Golf Club, and music was often heard in it as well. In the townland of Balnogan in Carlow, you have an example of a Linkerstown type tomb. Now, a Linkerstown type tomb is generally a large mound, and it's named after the first one that was excavated in Linkerstown, just outside Tinryland in Carlow. It was excavated in 1972 and revealed to, the mound was excavated in 1972, and it was revealed to contain a Neolithic burial at its core. And there was also later Bronze Age burials inserted in it. But before these excavations, and particularly at least at the time of recording in 1938, people used to believe that it was the home of the good people, or the She. And Mary Byrne of Busherstown recorded that there was a large mound in Staplestown, similar in size to the one in Ballinol, and that a bright light was often seen travelling from one mound to the other. Busherstown itself seems to have been some sort of inspiration or something like that for the foundry in town, because it hasn't got one ball of light story, it has several appearances of light and routeways for lights all over the place. So the first example is recorded by a Patrick Rossiter of Johnstown, and he said that there was a field in Mrs. Conlon's in Johnstown called the Fairy Field, and that every night at 9 o'clock a light comes across from Busherstown Cemetery to this field. Mary Kinsella of Bennecarry reported that in the year 1864, a light no bigger than a candle travelled from Grange Cemetery to Busherstown Cemetery, and that it continued to travel every night from 1864 until the spring of the year 1907, when it was last seen. And on that particular night of its last journey, it created the most awful noise on its way, and it frightened cattle that jumped ditches and even broke into houses on that night. There was also an account by a Michael O'Rourke and separately an Edward O'Rourke, who both described lights being visible in Hartley's Field in Busherstown, which was believed to be built by the fairies. And a Michael Pender of Archeology described light ascending into the air every night at 12 o'clock from the church field in Busherstown. There was another Michael Pender, this time of Johnstown. Well, he had a more rational reason for all these lights that were apparently appearing all over the place, because he said that in 1938, he said that there was a field in Friarstown called the Fox Cover. And he said that at night, the whole field used to appear as if it was on fire, or lights used to appear in the field. But he reflected the age of science that was starting to emerge in the early 20th century, because he explained that phosphorus was found in that field later on, and that explained the reason why people were seeing fires and lights in the field. So we finish up then back where we started, and in the modern day, with an explanation for all these strange goings on and around us and the bumps in the middle of the night. And I hope tonight's lecture is a small reflection of the volume of local history and heritage that's to be found not just in Pollerton, but every townland in Carlow and indeed across Ireland. And that I encourage you to take a closer look at the roads that you travel, the fields that we pass, and most importantly, the people in our localities who retain more information often than they realise. And whether you believe in these stories or not, whether you believe in these lights in the Banshee or whatever, they add colour and a different perspective to these familiar and everyday landscapes around us, and sometimes make those in the past seem that little bit closer. So I just want to thank Carlow County Council and the Creative Ireland programme, and Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, who made the funding available to clean up this burial ground and to record the inscriptions on the headstones. I want to thank John Tierney of Archeology and the Historic Graves of Ireland for his fantastic training and guidance. I want to thank our local volunteers and the volunteers from Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, who put in those 3 days in the heat of the summer of 2018, clearing the site and recording the transcriptions on the headstones. And without them, this couldn't have happened at all. Now, the long-term plan for the site is to try and keep the vegetation under some control, while also trying to maintain some of the biodiversity in the site. And to that end, I also want to say thanks to Councillors Fergal Brown and Tom O'Neill, who arranged for a subsequent maintenance of the burial ground, or a small cleanup in 2020 by the local authority. But it's also, just using that, it's important to highlight that a portion of the wall collapsed in 2020 that still needs repairing. And that needs to be central to any future maintenance or management plans in the burial ground. Muile buíochas as well to everyone who I've spoken to over the years, family, friends and acquaintances who took the time to impart a little bit of knowledge, which is ultimately added up to tonight's talk, and actually more, because it was a whole load of stuff that I just didn't have time to get into and ended up on the cutting room floor. Thanks also, of course, to Joe Callan, the landowner, and the National Monument Service, both of whom gave us permission to carry out the works. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen tonight. I hope there's been something of interest to everyone. And hopefully Pollerton Little, if you're not from the area, if you're from the town, or if you make your way through the town, I hope that it's a place, or that it'll be more than a place that you just drive through like a flash of light in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I think saying it was interesting is putting it mildly. I think you've been so enthusiastic and so passionate about the site of the Cruchán. It inspired lots of others, and I think it will always inspire people with enthusiasm like that. Just to say, we have a lot of people on Facebook tonight. If you're on Facebook and you'd like to put a question, type into the Facebook comments and we'll pick them up and give them to Jamie. There's one or two questions in on chat. I think, let me just see the, get one here. Noreen Whelan has one which says, superb research and investigations you've done. Are these verifiable in parish records of many religious denominations?
I haven't come across any parish records, so if anybody ever has come across any, I'd love to have a look at them. As I say, the only records that I can find of it are those kind of newspaper archives and the descriptions from the Board of Guardian works about enclosing it, and then of course the inscriptions or the local memories of people who were buried in it. But as I say, if there are records of it, I'd love for somebody to point me towards them.
Okay, that's great. Couple of comments in from Timothy O'Connor describing the talk as excellent, and from Eamon Russell, beautiful talk, one of the best I've heard. And I think that, you know, from everyone, I think that's what's coming across. If anyone wants to unmute their mic and come live and ask any questions, please do so. Helen, go ahead.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks so much for that really excellent presentation. What I just really was wondering was, what evidence did you find that there were infant burials in the Cruchán? Like, I know in St. Mullins there's stone markers at Timple Namo for the infant burials, and are there the same type of markers in the Cruchán, or is there some different sort of markers?
Like what I said, there was at least one family tradition anyway of it, at least of children being buried in it. But also, like I was saying, so you have those neat 10 rows, or what are almost neat 10 rows throughout the burial ground. But then there's all, like exactly like Temple Mo, actually, you have these small little stones that are out of step and don't fit properly into the neat rows, and that's why we're surmising that yeah, it was being used for the burial of children. I wouldn't say there's that many of them in it. I'd say a lot of those stones, because they fit into or they appear to fit into the neater rows, are probably family plots basically, just with no formal large headstones. But yeah, that's the two things basically: stones that are slightly out of step, and then that family tradition as well, or at least one family in the locality's tradition of babies being buried in it.
Okay, thanks.
Another comment from Marie. Thanks, Jamie. Brought some of the Rice family history alive. That's coming through on chat.
A few comments on Facebook as well, Patrick.
Go ahead if you take them there.
Yeah, Lucy Considine, Jamie, very interesting. Hilary Niever, Muile buíochas, Liz Whelan, wonderful, thank you so much. Anne Fitzgerald, wonderful talk, loved it.
Thank you.
And
the thing is, as in the other thing as well, I should have said as well, is that, as in, if anybody else is aware, because like I say, that we have the names that are recorded on the headstones, and there was that list of names that are provided, like the Snoddys, the Rices, the Murphys and Buckleys, who are, we know, or at least there's traditions of them being buried there. If there's other people, I'd love to at least have that record as well. So even if they add the comments on the chat and Facebook, or email as well, that'd be great.
Okay, that's gone, Jamie. If there's no further questions,
Have on, Patrick.
Go ahead, yeah, go ahead.
And Fitzgerald, as I said, did you mention consecrated ground? Maybe she might like to elaborate on that. Did you mention consecrated ground?
I presume it was consecrated anyway, especially when it was formally enclosed in the 1870s, and it was a Catholic burial ground. That's also the record that the Public Health Board made in the 1930s when they surveyed all the headstones. They note that it was only Catholics that were being buried in that burial ground.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay, I think I suppose on behalf of the Historical Society, I'd like to express our huge thanks to all the volunteers who actually did put the work in 2018. Yeah, there was a couple of society people, but outside that, there was a lot of friends and neighbours from out there who actually put far more hard work than some of us put in, and I'd like to thank them at this stage. John, if you're there, would you like to propose a vote of thanks to Séamus on behalf of the Society?
This lecture had everything, really, didn't it? Legends, otherworldliness, archaeology, local history, genealogy, culture, and it spanned the range of Irish history, you know, from the Neolithic times to modern Carlow, through pre-invasion, early medieval, the friaries, the Stuarts, the Restoration, penal times. It was a span for a small townland. And I think, Séamus, you're right, that there's so much history that we don't really know or take our time to look at in our own areas. Your enthusiasm for this area and for your home area is obvious, and it was infectious, and it brought out a load of us to battle against the nettles and the briars for a very hot day. And I was glad to be part of it, because it was a great experience. And just a little memory there as well, that when you spoke about the two gravel pits, I actually remember the second gravel pit, the smaller one, as a sort of a small overgrown valley with trees and greenery in it, and it was sort of a magical place. It really was. It was behind the road. You couldn't see it. To get through a hole in the ditch, you get into it. I always thought it was a tragedy that it disappeared with progress. But the other thing, just about death signs and the lights, yeah, it is a fairly common thing as well. In Quina, I know the Quina stone, which is a high cross with a ring on it. That the legend there was that when someone local died, lights would appear in the four corners of the cross. I think that's in Carlow, Vienna. I read it at some stage. But I suppose, if I take one thing out of it, Séamus, I think is your enthusiasm. And I think we have loads of interesting graveyards in Carlow, with history, with genealogy, with some really unusual and fantastic sculptures. And we need more people like you to give a lead to local communities as well. And I think your work on this has really been a very important work as well, and hopefully it'll inspire other people as well. So on behalf of Carlow Historical and Archaeological Society, I'd like to propose a vote of thanks. And on my own personal behalf, thanks very much. It was great.
Thanks a million, John. Thanks a million, Patrick. And just to follow up again from what you were saying, these things always snowball, don't they? The site, the gravel pit that you're talking about, that used to be known as the Hills and the Hollows. And it's on the site of what's now Pollerton Manor housing estate. So if anybody's living in Pollerton Manor, that was the old name for your, or at least the entrance to your housing estate.
Thanks, Séamus. I mean, you know, as John said, you're a fountain of knowledge, not just on your home area, but way beyond it. But I think tonight, being your home area, it was something special. Just two quick points before we finish the meeting. First of all, Carlow Vienna 2023, We're seeking articles at this stage for publication, which the publication will be in November. But if anyone is thinking of an article, please get them in to John Kelly, our editor, by July, if possible. And the second thing, my just quick reminder is the AGM will be on the 8th of June in the Seven Oaks Hotel. That's it. Look, thanks everyone. I think everyone had a great night. Bulabus, the Shemi, and it's a pity we're not doing it live, because I'd say the Bulabus would be a big one. Thank you, Shemi. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.